Pop Goes the 60s continues with part 3 of the Byrds. Now, when we last left you, the Byrds had just released Notorious Byrd Brothers. This was in early 1968, and they were enjoying some very nice reviews on this album. And unfortunately, they had been reduced to a duo, so you just had Chris Hillman and Roger McGuinn in the band at this point, having lost Michael Clark, the drummer, and having fired David Crosby. Now, many Byrd fans don't go beyond this album. They just go up through the folk rock and psychedelic period, and they stop there. But there's some very worthwhile Byrds music in the next couple of years. We're going to go into those here. Now, first of all, the Byrds had to hire a drummer, so they hired Chris Hillman's cousin, Kevin Kelley. Now, Kevin Kelley had played drums with the Rising Sons before this, and they also hired a guitar player and songwriter, Gene Parsons. Now, he was part of a band called the International Submarine Band, and they had just recorded an album recently, and that had yet to be released. So he was approached, and McGuinn was looking for a jazz pianist because the next album they were planning to do was this elaborate double album of American music in the 20th century, basically spanning from early country, bluegrass, and folk up through pop music and psychedelic, and ending, with folk rock, and ending with electronic music or more futuristic music. The problem was that both Hillman and McGuinn were really low on material. So Gene Parsons came in, and the country part of that whole scenario, Parsons really liked and said, hey guys, let's just go and do a country album. Because if you get the country crowd, you're never going to lose them. And Hillman, it was easy to talk Hillman into that because he had a very solid bluegrass background that borderlined on country. And McGuinn also liked country, so they went for it. Now, both Parsons and Kelley were salary players at this point, and the International Submarine album was released in March of 1968 to very little fanfare. Meanwhile, the Byrds recorded the first single that preceded the next album, and they did a Dylan song called You Ain't Going Nowhere. And this is one of the songs from the Basement Tapes, and as always, the Byrds always had it in with early Dylan material, so they recorded You Ain't Going Nowhere.
You ain't going nowhere.
This song had an undeniable country feel with the pedal steel guitar work of Lloyd Green. Now, on the B-side, it was a completely different story. They actually chose a song from the previous album, the song Artificial Energy. Now, this was a more psychedelic song, and it seemed like they maybe didn't want to alienate some of their fans and included this on the B-side. At this time, Derek Taylor had planned to rejoin the Beatles for their launch of Apple, so he left the West Coast, and at his farewell party at Ciro's, the Byrds played, and Gene Clark once again joined them on stage. And at a gig that was right around this time, Michael Clark joined and sat in for Kevin Kelley. So the Byrds that had just left were still on good terms with the other guys, and at this point, Gene Clark was looking to hook up with another record label or to have something going, and he recorded the song called Los Angeles. And this was in early 1968. There was going to be a single. This was never released, and this was his kiss-off to that fair city.
Los Angeles, city of doom.
So work continued on this next album that was yet to be named, and they did another Dylan cover called Nothing Was Delivered. So these two Dylan songs that kind of harkened to the old Byrds albums when they relied on Dylan. And as I said, that both Hillman and McGuinn were low on material. And in this next album, you'll see that they didn't record anything original at all. The only two original songs that were brought at this time were by Gene Parsons.
Nothing was delivered, and I tell this truth.
Parsons had wanted them very much to go in this country direction, and they had planned, or they had arranged to play at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. And Roland White, who was Clarence White's brother, helped get them acclimated to some of the musicians so that they would be accepted there. Now, the problem with their appearance there was that it didn't go very well. They weren't accepted. And although they cut their hair a bit and they donned acoustic instruments, Parsons' prediction that if you get the country crowd that you'll never lose them kind of backfired because they didn't even accept the Byrds. So as they continued to record this album, eventually called Sweetheart of the Rodeo, half the songs were recorded in Nashville and half back in Hollywood. And they did use some of the Nashville players as well to kind of ingratiate them into that whole scene.
The jukebox is playing silent through the trees of Hickory Wind.
Now that last song, Hickory Wind, has become a country standard, and that was an original song by Graham Parsons. Hickory Wind was initially going to be the title of the album. Meanwhile, they released another single, and they released I Am a Pilgrim, which was a traditional song, and this is lead sung by Chris Hillman.
I am a pilgrim and a stranger.
Now, Roger McGuinn played banjo on that song and on several other songs on this album, and ultimately the music they were producing now, which not only used country, I mean, I would consider this not a country rock album, but a straight country album. But there's elements of blues in here and rock influences, some folk. And so this would be called like Americana music or roots music. Now they prepared to do a tour of Europe at this time, and to support them they added banjo player Doug Dillard from the Dillards. That tour was actually quite successful. Now, when they came back from the tour to continue working on the album, there was a wrench thrown in the whole thing because the International Submarine Band, that was a contract with Lee Hazelwood, and Hazelwood threatened to sue if Parsons was going to be used on a Byrds album. So that made things difficult. So what they did is they removed some of the Parson lead vocals and put McGuinn's voice back on. And really, it didn't make a lot of sense to have most of the vocals by Graham Parsons anyway, because this is such a departure for the Byrds, going from this psychedelic rock to country, that if you had a different lead singer and the 12-string guitar was already being played down, a different singer would just sound like a different band. So I think that the label was aware of this, and certainly the members of the Byrds were aware of this. So McGuinn's vocals got put back onto a couple of the songs.
100 years from this day, will the people still feel this way?
Now the label realized that the Byrds were making a big change here, and they created an advertising campaign to go along with this. And one of the slogans was, "This country's for the Byrds," with the tagline that their message is all country and their sound is all Byrds. So they did a promo release for this album that basically is trying to let people know that, hey, this is really the Byrds singing.
See, it is the Byrds. They're doing Dylan.
It can't be the Byrds. Play another tune.
Where can the red-meat children?
So here's the album, and this artwork was taken from an old 1930s poster. Now, generally, this is a pretty mellow listen. This is a real comfortable album to listen to. I originally wasn't into country music, and still am not really, but I've come to appreciate this album quite a bit. And but the problem is that this idea of trying to capture the country crowd really backfired on them, because what it did is that it alienated some of their prior fans. So the people that were into the folk rock and psychedelic stuff, some of them had a hard time making this transition. And as such, it was their lowest charting album to date. The critics really love this album, and it was an example of how different the critics' view of certain things were as opposed to the fans, because the fans didn't respond in the same way the critics did to this album at all. And despite having a popular European tour, it didn't even chart in the UK. Now, one of the things about the Byrds albums from this point forward is they were often a poor judge of their own material. And some of the songs they recorded during, for instance, this album that were unreleased are actually quite good.
Daylight come, creeping in on me, bringing me nothing. Yes, it's just right. Pretty party, you guessed it just right. I dug on you, babe, the better part of last night.
Now those 3 songs can be found on the expanded CD edition of the album, and You've Got a Reputation is a little bit of a rock song that maybe didn't fit into this concept, but All I Have Are Memories is a pretty good Kevin Kelley song that he also sings lead on, and Pretty Polly is another traditional song that has plenty of electric 12-string guitar by McGuinn. Now Parsons was getting a little full of himself, and I think he was even suggesting the Byrds call themselves Grand Parsons and the Byrds, so that wasn't going to fly. Things started to reach a head in England. Now the Byrds went back to England for a tour, and they were starting to hang around the Rolling Stones quite a bit. And from England they were going to go to South Africa, which was usually unusual, but they wanted to bring their music there, and it was all arranged. Now Parsons was getting some whispering in his ear from the Stones that, hey, a lot of bands don't play down there because of apartheid. So Parsons decided the night before they were to leave for South Africa, I'm not going to go. So this put the Byrds in a very difficult position. They had to go down to South Africa without Parsons, who really just wanted to hang back in England and party with the Stones and take heroin with Keith Richards, which is pretty much what he did. And it had nothing to do with apartheid, believe me. So that's just one of the things when you are in the party lifestyle. I mean, Stones in London, Byrds in South Africa. So the South Africa trip ended up being very bad because they had to install Carlos Bernal, their road manager, to play guitar. And he wasn't quite ready for it. And this was just a day before Parsons left. So the dates were erratic sounding. The promoters were hassling the Byrds. The Byrds had thought they were going to play to some black audiences. That didn't happen. But the promoters had the tickets for the Byrds to get back home. So the Byrds had to play these. And then in the end, they didn't get paid for all of them anyway. So it was a horrible experience. And the Byrds started to badmouth South Africa in the press and things. So it went about as bad as it could go. So needless to say, Graham Parsons gets fired. And the natural person to bring in is Clarence White. He's kind of been waiting in the wings, I guess you'd say. He played on the last couple of Byrds albums. He was a bluegrass virtuoso player. This is an instance where they actually brought in a better player than their own lead guitarist. And this was much needed because the Byrds, the 12-string guitar sound maybe was getting dated anyway. So this country move was risky, but bringing in a fine player like Clarence White was a really excellent move. Clarence White already did play on this record. He played on the song Blue Canadian Rockies, and he used the string bender. That was a new invention that he came up with a friend of his called Gene Parsons, no relation to Graham. And I'll talk a little bit more about that guitar later, but it really added to the Byrds sound. Now also at this time, Kevin Kelley leaves the band. He gets fired. The reason why Kelley left the band, by bringing in Clarence White, who was brought on as a salary player, but I think he got more money. He was such a revered player. Very good, favorable terms were negotiated, and he really wanted to bring in one of his own players, which was drummer Gene Parsons. And Parsons, as I mentioned, had developed the string bender with him, and they played together in a band called Nashville West, which was essentially a bluegrass kind of rock band. And Clarence White really positioned to get Gene Parsons in the band, and that's how he joined. More changes were to come because this lineup didn't last very long. Chris Hillman left the band, and what happened was it was more of a management problem. They had hired a guy named Larry Spector. He had replaced the Dixon Tickner management, and this guy mismanaged their money. What happened, I believe, is the band was paid in advance, and the manager took part of that advance as his payment and quit. And he had negotiated a new album deal for the Byrds. And what he did in the negotiation is the Byrds had 100 hours of free studio time with each album. And he negotiated that out of the contract for some reason. That's extremely valuable. So he did that. He took his upfront money and left the band. And the band was kind of left high and dry. And they owed money, and Hillman was just sick of it at this point. He had enough, and he thought he could start something new on his own, and wasn't a guy that liked the limelight anyway. So that's why he left. So here we got one of the original founding members of the Byrds leaving, and that leaves McGuinn as the only founding member. Chris Hillman was replaced by a guy named John York, and York had played in the Sir Douglas Quintet, and I think he was in the touring version of the Mamas and the Papas as well. And he was a good singer, and so he was added. Another change that was made at this time was Gary Usher was fired. And he had produced Chad and Jeremy's album of Cabbages and Kings. That was also on Columbia. And that went way over budget. And Usher was fired over that. So now without Gary Usher, they brought in another Columbia producer, Bob Johnston. And he had produced a lot of Dylan albums. He had produced Johnny Cash and Simon and Garfunkel. And with all these new players, this next album predictably sounds a little bit uneven. They were trying to win back some of the original Byrd fans that they had lost, and they were trying to stay on the roster because Sweetheart of the Rodeo didn't do very well for the label. So as they began recording this next album, there was some trepidation. The first song, or one of the early songs they recorded, was Dylan's This Wheel's on Fire. Now this was another song from the Basement Tapes. And there's an early version where their sound is a little bit like the old Byrds. Wonderful guitar, electric guitar by Clarence White. Check this out.
If your memory serves you well.
Now I love the sound of that song, but they went back to the drawing board and re-recorded it, and they did it with a much heavier sound. And by this time, this is later 1968, so harder rock is starting to come out, and I think that they had to update their sound a little bit. They re-recorded that song, and it sounds like this.
If your memory serves you well, of the darkness you pushed me in, you say that it's a sin, we're hanging around.
So that last song was Bad Night at the Whiskey, and that's indicative of this new heavier sound, and that was released as a single, but it did not chart. And one of the problems is I think the title Bad Night at the Whiskey is nowhere in the lyrics, so it's always hard to request a song when you don't know the title of the song.
Freaks collecting stained glass rubies diligently on a string. Bye bye blue, you dog you.
Now at this time they also started working on music for a soundtrack for the film Candy.
Child of the universe, giving freely of herself away like candy.
Child in the Universe was used on the soundtrack, but the song Candy was not, so it just appears on this album, Dr. Byrds and Mr. Hyde. Now this album does have some filler on it. They were low on material, and one of the songs they redo, it's a medley of My Back Pages, BJ Blues, and Baby, What You Want Me to Do. I think that's a song that's not good at all, doesn't really belong on here. Truck Store Driving Man, that's also another weak song. And this album cover, this kind of space cowboy, I don't know if they're metamorphosizing into this country kind of electronic space thing. It doesn't work for me. The bodies are coming out of the heads. I don't know. Kind of a goofy album cover that doesn't work. Now, one of the highlights of this album is Clarence White's playing. Now, he's a great player. He's using the string bender guitar. Really, the first time it was used a lot on a recording. He's using an electric 12-string that's heavily tremoloed in some cases. And generally speaking, his playing just elevates this whole record in spite of some very weak material. A single that they released at this time was the song Lay Lady Lay. This is the Dylan song, and again the Byrds got an early version of it so that they could release it before Dylan. And the problem is that the Byrds, for as good as they could cover a Dylan song, occasionally they do a bad cover, and this is one of them. And what made it even worse was producer Bob Johnston added these awful gospel vocals to this song.
I'll show them to you and you'll see them shine. Lay, lady, lay across my big...
So those gospel vocals are jarringly inappropriate to my ears anyway, and that got Bob Johnston fired. That song charted at a dismal number 132. Dylan's came out a couple months later and went top 10. It just was a very bad showing for the Byrds. Now there's a version on the expanded CD version of this album that has those gospel vocals taken away, which sounds much better.
I show them to you, you see them shine.
So Dr. Byrds and Mr. Hyde charted even worse than Sweetheart of the Rodeo, and this idea where the Byrds are trying to play two sides of the coin by being old Byrds and new Byrds didn't really work, and things were looking grim, and were they going to be able to stay on the Columbia roster? Well, help came in another film, and that was Easy Rider. And the characters in that film were actually based on McGuinn and David Crosby. And Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, and Terry Southern had just finished writing it, and they were looking for some original music for it. And they approached Dylan, and Dylan wrote some lyrics, but then handed them off to McGuinn to finish. So that became the theme song of the film, Ballad of the Easy Rider.
That's where I want to be, flow, river, flow.
A Ballad of Easy Rider was a minor hit, number 65, and another song that was also used on the soundtrack was another Byrd song called I Wasn't Born to Follow from Notorious Byrd Brothers. Then they released that as a single as well. That didn't chart, but at least the Byrds were getting back into the swing of things here, and the counterculture was starting to recognize the Byrds again because their music appeared in the ultimate counterculture film. The soundtrack for the movie was released in August of '69. And it's got a nice selection of different bands like Jimi Hendrix Experience, Steppenwolf, Fraternity of Man, Electric Prunes, and this was a big hit. While the Byrds were recording the next album, called Ballad of Easy Rider, this album was released, the Byrds Pre-Flight. So these were those earlier recordings before the first album, Mr. Tambourine Man. And this was compiled onto an album and released on Together Records. And this was more of an archival label, and it actually started to sell. It moved like 200,000 copies and charted at number 84. So that was a little bit of a surprise and showed that the old Byrds had still quite a lot of value. The Ballad of Easy Rider is the next album. This came out in November '69, and this hit number 36 on Billboard's Top 200 chart. And this was a huge jump in popularity, no doubt from the appearance of their music in the soundtrack of the same name. This album also was produced by Terry Melcher. After having fired Bob Johnson, they returned to the friendly confines of Melcher's production studio. And at this point, he really put a lot of effort into this album as if he was a member of the band himself.
Fido stayed all night, he would not go home. I asked him to leave, and I'll give you the chance, and I'll send you to sea once more. Jesus is just alright with me. Jesus is just alright, oh yeah.
So that last song, Jesus is Just Alright, was released as a single but did not chart well at all, only at number 97. One of the Dylan songs they had on here was a song called It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and that was a song they originally tried to cut back in late 1965, and it just didn't work.
But if there's something you wish to keep, you better grab it fast.
Now, Gene Parsons chips in with the song Gunga Din, which is very good, but on some of the songs that McGuinn doesn't sing, it doesn't quite sound like the Byrds.
Writing this here letter from aboard a DCA, getting in too deep. There must be someone I can turn to.
All you will be deportees.
Now, one of the problems with the Byrds albums in general is they tend to have kind of a joke song that closes one of the sides, like we had Oh Susanna and We'll Meet Again, and weak songs in my opinion, and they were foregoing better original material. And that happens here again with the song called Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, kind of a throwback to the Learjet song from the Fifth Dimension album, and that actually closes this record. Now, the Beatles had closers like A Day in the Life, and the Byrds have closers like this song.
Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were launched
So this album is generally regarded a pretty solid album. Obviously there are some weak spots, but as I mentioned on the last couple of albums, the CD expanded version has some unreleased songs that was recording during this time that are excellent. One of the great songs they do, one of the great instrumentals, is a song called Build It Up. So those last two songs, Fiddler or Dram is a traditional song that sounds more like the early Byrds, and May Jean Goes to Hollywood is a very early Jackson Browne song that they cover, and that was not originally released, but can be found on the expanded CD version. The liner notes on the back of this album are done by Peter Fonda, and the Byrds end the 60s on a very high note. Now the 70s, the Byrds have one last hurrah, and then it kind of fizzles out, but it fizzles out in a very good way with a reunion album. We're going to talk about that in the next installment here on Pop Goes the 60s.